Okay, I'm admitting everyone. We are live on Facebook and I'm starting our recording. Hi everyone, good morning to those that are here in the West Coast. Hello for those that are in the East Coast or in Israel. We are very excited to have you today. We'll give it another couple of seconds to make sure that people can actually join in. I see we still have more people in the wait room, so we'll let them join before we start this session. I just want to remind everyone, as we are waiting for more people to join us this morning, that this is actually intended to be a seminar, which is really an open Q&A discussion session. So I invite you to share your cameras if you can. This is always great, so we can see you. And really feel free to, jump in and ask your questions. Tell us more about, things that you see at your work. If there are issues or problems and questions that you can share with us, that will be great. It's really intended to be some sort of a brainstorming, if you like, session. So while we are waiting for other friends to join the session, I'd like to welcome you again to another seminar from the California Israel Chamber of Commerce, the CICC. My name is Sharon Vanek. I'm the Executive Director of the CICC based here in California. And we also have my colleague in Israel, Tammy Dorst. For those who don't know, the California Israel Chamber of Commerce is a non-for-profit organization with the intent to introduce Israeli companies and other stakeholders to their fellows here in California and the other way around in a variety of tech-related industries. With us this morning, we have Elizabeth Litten. She's a partner at Fox Rothschild. Good morning, Elizabeth. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm well, thank you.
Okay, can you share with us a few words about your work before we dive into the content of this morning's seminar?
Happy to, thank you. So I'm a practicing attorney. I've been practicing for quite a while with a focus on healthcare. And I also am the co-chair of our firm's privacy and data security practice group. I also serve in an executive type position. I serve as the chief privacy officer and HIPAA compliance officer for the law firm. So I'm very interested in this topic and looking forward to the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Fantastic. We also have with us Abhishek Agarwal. He is the CISO of Fresenius Medical Care. Hi, Abhi. How are you?
Hello. How are you? Thanks for having me join this esteemed group of people. It's a pleasure and honor to be on this platform. As you mentioned, I'm a Chief Information Security Officer for Fresenius Medical Care. It's the world's largest dialysis manufacturer and care services company in the world. In my role, I also have privacy, information governance, cybersecurity, med device security as an area of responsibility. So quite a mouthful, but it makes my jobs interesting, keep me involved every day. I'm happy to share my experience, my thoughts on some of the prevailing topics here, and happy to take any questions. Like you said, it's a back and forth dialogue. And one thing I'll definitely say it as a disclaimer is that these opinions are going to be my personal opinions and not my company's opinion. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abhi, for this introduction. And our third speaker for this morning is Ben-Aderet. He is the co-founder and the CEO of GRSee Consulting. Hi, Ben.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure being here. As Sharon has mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GRSee Consulting. We are a cyber and security consulting and compliance firm founded 12 years ago with offices in Israel, and New York, California, and a global team spread across the US and in other countries as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Ben, for this introduction. So really the purpose of the discussion today is we hear so many times people talk about medical devices, digital health, together with cybersecurity, with compliance, and we hear it more and more about it. So I think before we start any discussion, we should start with you, Elizabeth. Can you explain to us how is cybersecurity linked with healthcare regulatory requirements?
Sure, absolutely. And just my disclaimer is my focus is going to be on the US regulatory landscape here. So in the United States, the most pervasive national law we have is HIPAA in terms of a privacy and data security law. We do have a plethora of state-by-state regulatory requirements that deal with both privacy and breach notification and security type legislation. But HIPAA is our most pervasive law, and there are specific cybersecurity requirements that pertain to healthcare devices or healthcare covered entities and business associates, which are classifications under HIPAA, subject to HIPAA compliance. We also, though, have the Federal Trade Commission, which monitors unfair and deceptive practices. So if a company is making a claim about its cybersecurity to users who are inputting data, and that claim is not accurate, the FTC can bring in enforcement action. So cybersecurity and the security of information, it really goes more toward the context and the industry in which the data is being collected and whether HIPAA applies. But there are state laws, and there are also, you have to be concerned about the FTC. Other specific laws pertain to other industries like the banking industry and the security of information there. But for today's focus, I think the primary cybersecurity regulations that are pertinent are those connected with HIPAA and with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission.
So before we dive into questions like what developers need to do and who should be responsible for either cybersecurity or privacy, you mentioned all kind of big buzzwords. How about we start with some explanations? So can you describe the terminology and the definitions related to medical device cybersecurity?
Sure, and I have
and
a couple
also
of
privacy.
Sure, absolutely. I have a couple of slides here that I will share my screen briefly.
Thank you.
So hopefully you can see
Yes,
the slide here. This is sort of a common alphabet soup of terms that I wanted to put together for you. So I already mentioned HIPAA. That's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was passed in 1996. It was amended by HITECH in the early 2000s. And we have had a continuing stream of regulations and interpretations around HITECH that come out, around HIPAA and HITECH that have been published by the agency that enforces HIPAA and HITECH, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Civil Rights. I also have listed the California Consumer Privacy Act. Right now, that's our most comprehensive state law. And those of you in California, I'm sure, are familiar with CCPA. We have the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Now, these are not regulatory requirements. This is an organization in Washington, D.C. that spends a lot of time studying best practices and works in conjunction with the agencies. So really informs a lot of what the agencies recommend in terms of cybersecurity practices and privacy practices. I wanted to mention SOC 2, which is the American Institute of CPAs. They developed a service organization control compliance platform. So this often is used as a standard for auditing the cybersecurity of a device or an organization. The ISO standards are often referred to. These are the international organization. This is the International Organization for Standardization. They've published best practices for systemic security controls and processes. So you'll often see the ISO 27001 and 27701 standards referred to. I also wanted to mention HITRUST. Now, this is a voluntary organization created by some big players in the US market after the HITECH as a response to HIPAA and HITECH, to say, let's take the best cybersecurity protocols and requirements, regulatory requirements across industries, and we'll determine whether you can meet those standards that apply to you, but really taking sort of the top regulatory cybersecurity pieces from each applicable regulation and just looking at whether a large organization can meet those requirements. So typically it's the very large health insurance carriers, very large health providers that will seek high trust certification. A couple more I wanted to throw in here.
Yes, we need to get these off the table, so make sure everybody understand what we are talking about.
Yeah, and when we start throwing out some of these acronyms, you'll have some familiarity. I mentioned the Office for Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They enforce HIPAA. We have ONC, which is another agency within HHS. It's the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. Now, that's another area of recent regulatory focus. The ONC published rules last May that take effect in April. And the gist of these rules that affect in the medical industry, device industry, and technology is that they prohibit information blocking and require interoperability of information among systems. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, the FDA. That's the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And the reason I mention the FDA is depending on your device or your technology, you may be regulated by the FDA. There are some exemptions depending on the classification and what your device actually does and what you're claiming the device or technology can do. But that's something else to be aware of, that the FDA is also involved in some respects with medical technology.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for sharing that information. Great. So, we see that healthcare organizations have started demanding better security from medical device manufacturers, and many have implemented already procurement processes that address the cybersecurity of the device itself, like secure installation, site-based security support for the life of the product in the field, liability of breaches, and so on and so forth. Abhi, I have a question for you. For both as a manufacturer and also someone that procure products from other manufacturers, do you think that cybersecurity and privacy programs should be managed separately in an organization which is similar to yours? Abhi, you are muted.
Oh, thanks. It really depends on the size and the business's practices. Not one size fits all, and it also depends on the risk, that how the company really looks at the enterprise risk overall beyond just cybersecurity and privacy. In general sense, if there are much more dependencies on privacy operations, like in a healthcare service organization, then yeah, you are required to essentially embed the necessary privacy operational controls within the business practices. And it serves the purpose for a company, because most of the laws that are required to comply by are resulted into security controls or technology controls that are required to be implemented within a business process. So in some cases, it's easy to encrypt the data. For example, when you are sending your data from one patient to another patient or one doctor to another doctor. And in other cases, it could be very financially driven and still not practical to implement those controls. So it's a case-by-case scenario. The other example that I can tell you is that many times that the businesses often struggle with is how do they really meet both the requirements when they look at it from two different point of views or two different individuals. So in those cases, cost can certainly become a concern, so I would highly encourage that, bring your heads together, bring your extended partners together in this dialogue, which is beyond just technology and compliance and legal. Bring your business partners together as well and understand how your business process flows, and then make a calculative decision, which also is economical to your management.
Great. So really, since we have some, manufacturers or startups on the line, my question to you, Abhi, is that, when you start an engagement with a vendor, what sort of assurance do you require in regards to compliance? Is it HIPAA compliance or high trust certificate or any, the ISO 27701 that we heard about? What kind of assurance you require?
I would let Elizabeth chime in after I say something because my partner in crime is legal. No, on a serious note, these are very serious matters, and it's very essential that the corporation have a policy that is built based upon the business practice. In general, in my experience, I've seen that the corporations have a policy that have multiple players that allows a vendor to come and pitch their product or services to a corporation. And assuming that one goes through it and the management decides to bring that vendor on board, they have to go through a certain type of process. So from security standpoint, I can certainly tell you that there is a third-party risk assessment process that one has to comply by. And that really depicts the onboarding process that is based on internationally recognized frameworks and regulatory requirements that Elizabeth mentioned on her previous slides. That were very helpful. Now, specifically for medical device manufacturers, in the space of cybersecurity, it's a little bit of a undefined or wide playing field. If in the United States, you do take into FDA requirements into account. There are industry recognized best practices. We call them MDS2. If somebody haven't heard it, Google it and you'll find it. It's a set of requirements that specifically highlights the medical device security. Again, device security these days is a very upcoming area, and there are certain aspects of the industry that have agreed upon to comply or build the platform on the best practices. High trust is another one that Elizabeth shared earlier. So really, the key note here is that the company has to have a policy that is built on an industry recognized framework, and make sure that you engage with your legal partners and procurement partners so that they all can chime into this process. Elizabeth, I didn't want to say anything about legal. If you have anything.
No, it's okay. So basically, if I understand you correctly, you're not going to acquire any product, software or medical device or whatever it is without making sure that they have all the compliance certificates and assurance that are required nowadays. So basically,
Right.
that's a threshold that they all have to pass.
It's beyond regulation. This is also an ethical topic. A manufacturer, if they are known through a process of manufacturing a device that impacts people's life on a daily basis, they would rather know and meet those requirements first than evade or try not to do it. So it goes back and forth between the buyer and the seller, the manufacturer and the buyer. In our aspect, that's how we look at the relationship. It's a partnership that we are striving for.
I see. So I have a question to you, Ben. First of all, we need to know how medical device companies can protect themselves. Do you think that companies, again, we talk about medical device as a bigger umbrella to digital health, to pharma, to, it's everything under Medtech, right? So when I talk to companies, I see that people focus on their solution that they develop, right, or the product that they develop. Do they need to have cybersecurity program in-house, or can they outsource it? What would you recommend? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I think when you, and as you mentioned, medical devices, that's a very broad term. In my experience, and we've been working with many startups in the health space. You know, medical devices company can be anything from, it could be a combination of a platform that you have, you know, a combination of a SaaS solution and maybe an endpoint device that you need to secure. And you need to make sure that, you know, the entire chain is secure here. And I think we need to take a step back and understand what it is that we're trying to protect first. And you know, ask ourselves basic questions such as, what market are we after? What type of information we will be holding, processing, and storing? Is it does it contain PII or also PHI? And you know, once we have that understanding, I think both Abhi and Elizabeth alluded to that. I think the first thing that we need to consider is to put in place a cybersecurity program. Whether that's internal or external really depends on, you know, the maturity level that you have as a company, as a startup company. If you have internal resources that are able to cope with that and push this forward, you can definitely do it in-house. From my experience, a lot of younger startup companies tend to outsource that portion until they grow into a certain level of maturity. But I think at the base here, we need to consider establishing a cybersecurity program that will answer those key questions and take into account, like, you know, what it is that we're trying to protect, what types of companies are we trying to sell to, and according to that, we can align the security program that we have in place.
Got you. I just want to pause for a second and remind our audience that if you have questions, you can always jump in and ask a question, or you can use the chat box to ask your questions. So Ben, I have another question for you. Can you list or somehow try to summarize what are the most common vulnerabilities in medical device? So where are the pain points for those developers?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm not sure there is like one list that can rule them all. I think it really goes back to the type of solution that you have. So, for example, if you're very focused on providing a SaaS type of solution, so in that case, the attack surface is basically your website and the application that your customers consume through that website. And in my experience, a lot of times we've discovered, like, you know, running the first penetration test on those types of companies, that they do have some open holes there. But then if you look at the flip side of that, and you actually consider the device itself, again, it goes back to what type, the type of architecture. Like, is this device a Bluetooth device connected directly to the cloud, or is it a device that's installed and integrated into a hospital environment? So the answer here would vary depending on that. For example, let's consider a hospital for a minute. You know, if you integrate a device that needs to be an integrated part of the network, and, you know, so you need to consider all kinds of things here, and make sure the ecosystem is secure. Because, for example, we had a customer in the past that, you know, provided in an earlier edition, they provided a solution to a hospital, and through that device, because they didn't do patch management accordingly, they were able to, you know, to get hit by a ransomware at some point. So it really goes back to the type of solution and architecture that you have in place, I think.
Got you. So Elizabeth, before we go back to Ben and ask about the procedures and how we make sure that we have, you know, all of this in place, as a startup company that develops some sort of a solution, it can be a medical device or a digital health or anything else in that realm. What is the scope of my responsibility as the startup, as the developer, towards you know, cybersecurity or privacy? Can I just tell the clients, okay, here is the product, embed it in your own system, and take care of cybersecurity and privacy within, you know, the procedures that you have in place? Or do I what is my responsibility? Where is the end of my responsibility?
Well, I'd like to go back. I mean, maybe this reflects something that Ben mentioned, but I think that, you know, if you start with privacy by design, so you're looking at your, you know, what your product is intended to do, what information it's collecting, and you have an obligation, I think, to be thinking about how, to the extent you're collecting identifiers, whether it's whether it's a diagnosis code or a name, or, you know, you kind of want to go through any type of identifier. But even some of the identifiers, I'm thinking of the HIPAA identifiers, some of the identifiers that may not seem like obvious to be individually identifiable. If you're collecting even a date of a service, that could be put together with other information to identify someone. You want to think about what data you're collecting, and you have an obligation to keep that information private, both in terms of your customer relationship and the individual, the person whose information is being collected. But you have an ethical and business obligation to keep it private, but you also should be aware of what laws apply to you. So HIPAA doesn't always apply. If you're doing a personal health record of some sort in connection with your product, the FTC health breach notification law may apply. You want to look at what obligations you have under the applicable laws, but you also want to think about what data you're collecting and what your responsibilities are toward the expectations of your customer and the individual whose information may be collected.
I see. So Ben, how should manufacturers, the startups, how can they assess the risk of their products?
Yeah, and I wanted to add, I think my question will also shed some more light on or actually add to what Elizabeth just said. So when an organization comes to comes to the first stages of establishing a security program, and you have a few industry leaders here, as you mentioned before, Elizabeth, SOC 2 being one of them, ISO 27001, with the possible extension of ISO 27701 as well. So all of these frameworks are international frameworks. And for example, with ISO 27001, one of the key aspects actually is around compliance. So it forces you as a startup company to think about your obligation when it comes to legal aspects, to understand what laws are applicable to you. It might be HIPAA, might be GDPR, might be other laws as well, maybe CCPA. And once you have that understanding, you can weave those specific requirements and controls into your security programs. And this is how you can address them in a very managed and structured way. Does that answer the question, Sharon?
I think so, yes. Thank you. So there are many, yes.
Hi, this is Rafi. I have a question.
Rafi.
I don't know if I'm jumping in the right time.
Go ahead, it's okay. Maybe you'll start the,
Yeah, turn the wheel.
Turn the wheel on. Yeah, go ahead, Rafi.
Okay, so just reminding that EcoCare is in the field of remote home care for elderly care. So actually I have a question maybe for Elizabeth. I have two questions. The first one is, we are in the gray area, so we are not a pure medical device. We are not FDA regulated yet, means by regulation. It's mainly for safety wellness, like fall detection, tracking ADL, and etc. So how should we assess whether we should follow HIPAA? By default, we plan to follow HIPAA, but we always have an open question whether we are required, such as a medical device, or this is something which is not well defined. So that's my first question for you.
I hear you, and this is an area I get these questions very, very frequently because this is a gray area in HIPAA. Part of it depends on, for HIPAA to apply, there has to be a covered entity somewhere, and there has to be a covered entity is the bedrock of the trigger for HIPAA. And a covered entity under HIPAA is a healthcare provider who engages in electronic standard transactions, and these are all defined terms, or a healthcare clearinghouse, or a health plan. And so if you're a direct-to-consumer device, you may not have anything to do with the covered entity. You may not have a relationship with the covered entity, so HIPAA technically wouldn't apply. However, if you're billing as a healthcare provider, you may actually be considered a covered entity healthcare provider. Again, you have to engage in electronic transactions, which would be submission of claims. It's a very typical one. Or if you have a relationship, if you're providing the service through, that if you're acting as a business associate, which means a vendor that is providing a service on behalf of a covered entity that requires or uses, creates, receives, maintains, transmits protected health information, individually identifiable health information in conjunction with that service provided to a covered entity. So when you crunch that all down and you apply it in to a medical device, it's clear as mud. It's not completely clear. And the HIPAA guidance, the OCR has there's guidance on the website about when information can be disclosed to a medical device manufacturer. It's not particularly helpful because you have to go back and do the analysis. Who are you offering your product to? Who's paying for it? Are you a covered entity? If not, is there a covered entity involved with your distribution of your product? Are you providing the service on behalf of a covered entity? And you really need to do sort of a case-by-case analysis. My recommendation generally is that if HIPAA doesn't apply to you, do not act as though it does, because you will be subjecting yourself to a lot of unnecessary and at times confusing obligations, and confusing to the consumer, confusing to whoever you're contracting with. Instead, there are other standards, best practice standards. If you've done the analysis and you're not subject to HIPAA, you can look to other security protocols and privacy standards, and then just make sure you're being as truthful as possible in terms of your privacy notice, in terms of use to the consumer as to what you're doing with the data.
Got it. So as a bottom line, I'm understanding that today, by the way, we of course, we have security to the cloud, etc. But just to understand what the expectation from our customers. So my understanding that B2C, like direct to consumer, we are not required to, but B2B, like remote home care operators, means working with remote home care operators, and especially if it's reimbursed service, most probably we will need to follow that.
Right.
This is my understanding. So my other question is, assuming we work with a remote home care operator, is it so? And let's assume that our system, let's call it our subsystem, is not including any connection to the privacy or to a concrete name. We just like a device ID. And the point that this device ID is attached to the actual person name and all the personalities in the nursing call system, which is my third-party partner or customer. So my other question is whether, assuming that all our system is not including any privacy information in a way that it's attached to some ID, but nothing regarding to personal information. So what HIPAA says about this part?
Yeah, so you want to be really careful. If HIPAA applies, if you're acting as a business associate and HIPAA applies, then you'd be surprised at the breadth of detailed, that singular piece of data, including a device identifier, can be considered protected health information. So even though it's not what you might generally think about as being an identifier, or even if it's not considered an identifier under another law, you have to look at the particulars of HIPAA and do an analysis as to whether, that piece of information is still considered protected health information, such that you have to comply with HIPAA for everything, with respect to, for example, if you're using a cloud service provider to store the data, you'll want to make sure you're using their health product. So like Amazon Web Service has a product, Google has a product. They will typically say to you, if you're giving us health information and we're acting as your business associate or subcontractor, which is the downstream business associate, then you need to purchase this product because we're we're acting as, we have to comply with HIPAA. And to the extent you're not purchasing that product or using this particular cloud service product, we expect you not to give us that data. So you have to be really careful. You have to understand what you are under HIPAA in the eyes of HIPAA. And then if you are subject to HIPAA, you've got to make sure you have a enterprise-wide, meaning every contract, every device approach to making sure you're complying with HIPAA across the board, meaning that you're not sending PHI without a business associate agreement. You know, you've done your HIPAA security risk assessment, you're auditing yourself, you've got policies and procedures. It's an ongoing compliance process.
Okay, got it. Thanks a lot.
Great,
It
thank
definitely
you.
answers.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rafi, for this question. And
Thanks.
thanks, Elizabeth, for your answer. And again, guys, if you have any questions to any of our speakers or any of your fellow, you know, those that are online, just don't be shy and you can always ask us. So I'm moving forward to the more maybe practical aspects. So from what I understand, there are many aspects of incorporating security into the development culture, right? So these can be broadly lumped into activities that promote security in the products versus activities that convey a false sense of security and are actually just a waste of time. So we want to know what we need to do actually to make sure that it's already embedded in the development process. Abhi, I have a question for you. So if you could give one piece of advice to a startup company that develops a product or a service that might be of interest to you, right? What that would be?
Hire an expert who is certified by an industry recognized organization. There are many that plays in that space. It really depends on your product that you are pursuing. For example, if your product is integrating with cloud, then go for a cloud security certification like AWS, Azure, or Google. I'm technology agnostic, so you pick one. Why I'm saying that is that it's the individual and the knowledge and experience that brings to the table to address the issue or the problem. When you're designing a device, many times because you're a startup company, cost is always a consciousness in terms of you know, how you design a device, medical device. And many times you expect your developer should automatically cover the security aspect. That is often not true, because from a developer standpoint, the goal is to develop a product or a solution. From a security standpoint, you need a mindset that constantly looks at it from those tangents that will address the security aspect behind it. So you know, pick what's a right skill set, what's a right mix for your environment, but don't discount the need for security. If your developer is not used to the concepts of security by design or privacy by design, then it's very hard for you to address it after you have finalized your design and push them into manufacturing. It's more costly for you to come back. So your individual who's really responsible for building up the right security within the device should have some sort of security certification based on, you know, what your product is doing.
Thank you, Abhi, for that. So Ben, what is your opinion? You know, when designing a solution suitable for the health space, what factors should be taken into consideration?
Well, I think it needs to play together and come into play as part of your overall cybersecurity program, as we've mentioned before. But I think you would need to ask yourself very basic questions, and maybe even ensure that when you design and develop the product, you take into consideration questions such as, like privacy by design. Do I really need to be transmitting like full PHI data here? Do I really need to be transmitting or storing PII data? And once you build that into your design process, you might find yourself in a better position with a better security posture in terms of having a smaller footprint and a smaller attack surface. And I think that's what usually what we strive to achieve. I don't think you'd be able to completely, avoid the need to have a security program in place. But I do think that if you do it properly and then you ask yourself the questions during the design process, and you put in place a proper SDLC process, and you train your developers, and you have the discussions around the security and privacy of your products and your offering, that would put you in a better position when you want to start talking to B2B, to companies in the B2B space. Because at the end of the day, I mean, in my experience, at some point when you try to sell to that in that space, to the B2B, you will need to you'll need to present something around your compliance program, whether it's ISO 27001 certificate, SOC 2 Type 2 report, or any other type of framework that you can demonstrate that you're in compliance with. Because at the end of the day, companies such as like medical companies such as the company that Abhi is working for, at the end of the day, they're looking to see that their compliance program is intact, that they're not exposing themselves to any to any risks of not complying with HIPAA. So they need to make sure that their supply chain is secure. And I think it goes back to what Habi said before, that they'll start by doing a risk assessment and then assessing where does this vendor like where exactly it's positioned in terms of like what type of vendor they are. But after that, they'll probably ask for something. So, and again, it goes back to specifically your offering, but they will want to see something around compliance, and through the design, like the putting in place a proper design phase, asking yourself those questions, and obviously, as I said, be able to provide a better security posture and a smaller footprint. I think that's what should be the focus.
I see. So, Abhi mentioned earlier the connectivity of devices, of information, and so on. So, and we see an incredible increase in network, medical devices, which obviously create a huge surface area for potential attacks. Ben, how do you prepare for that?
Well, again, going back to specifically what your product does or how the solution looks like, but let's just take, for example, like a network device or a medical device that you want to be integrated into a hospital environment. The CISO of that hospital would have to be crazy just integrating that piece of software or even hardware into his network without running it through very basic security practices, such as conducting a full risk assessment, conducting a full penetration test. Now the vendor could provide some kind of a penetration testing report, maybe just for like the out of the box type of solution here, just to appease the mind of the buyer. But basically, I think risk assessment and penetration testing are probably the most I think the best tools to deal with that here, in my opinion.
Can I add one more point to it?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So, in the real world, and let's take an example of COVID that happened last year, right? The time was not on our side, meaning we couldn't move fast enough to help out people. The challenge was, because we're talking about connected healthcare, the challenge was the patients who needed immediate attention could not go and see the doctors in the clinics. There were no provisions in place in which the doctor is available to see the patient in person. And that created a need for telehealth or remote patient conversations. Many apps that became available. And then the topic of privacy and security immediately popped up. Even I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the United States, the federal government gave a waiver or some sort of arrangement between the companies that they could, for a brief period of time, could not worry about the necessary implications and save people and help them out as much as possible. There are two aspects of that environment that we were living in and we will continue to live in. One is that at the end goal is to help the patient. How quickly can we allow a physician, a healthcare practitioner, to get to the patient using a safe and secure way of technology? The risk to the company is that whether are we going to get into trouble with compliance? Are we going to create a safe and secure environment in which we can have a safe transaction with the patient? And as a CISO, I would ask, it's an ecosystem that we operate in. So I'll ask my partner that make sure that you have a sort of a futuristic vision when you are building up your designs around your medical device. Your medical device is a part of our ecosystem that operates on an inherent security risk platform. And it's very important for you to understand that the paperwork is good enough. We'll go through those, but in the epidemic scenario, when the paperworks are hardly available for you to sign off on any risk, how can you keep that commitment to your patient, to your company, where you have built up a developer, manufactured a device that will address the prevailing risk in the environment? The hackers are not going to wait for a waiver that I'm not going to hack this company because they have waiver now. So the reality is very different on the ground. And the things that you can think about is that you have a connected device that connects with the network. Keep enough flexibility on your platform that it immediately plugs and play. So if you're looking at the baseline architecture of any network, forget about its healthcare, finance, or education, or any sector, make sure you make your device enough compatible with the existing technology frameworks, which like SIM, make sure that you can capture event logs that feeds into some kind of SIM that can help us see. So looks at the dashboard. There are device reports that are available, and there are vendors who can give you the device report. So some vendors stack a security report of about 10 to 20 million devices that get manufactured in the marketplace. So build some systems within your framework and follow the industry framework. But if you tap into this opportunity where you can make your device more easily compatible from security standpoint, I think that will help you lead the marketplace in that space.
Perfect. Thank you, Abhi, for that. I'm going to put on the spot another CISO of a major manufacturer of medical device that is with us today. Hi, Uma. How are you? You're muted.
Hi, Sharon. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Of course, of course. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Uma Chandrasekhar. I'm the Global Product Information Security Officer for Alcon. Those of you who probably, I'm sure, have heard of Alcon in some form or another, we are actually responsible for many of you who wear contact lens, drops, dry eye, medical devices that support cataract. Everything to do with the ophthalmologic space is kind of our role.
Okay, great. So, Uma, what advice do you have, both as a manufacturer, someone who deals with a lot of vendors, to the product developers in terms of incorporating their cybersecurity and privacy protocols through the design process?
No, first of all, I have to echo all of the folks who spoke here. I mean, Abe, Elizabeth, Ben. I mean, all of this is it's work in progress. You know, I think one of the challenges I think we have in our industry is that it's evolving so much. There are so many different areas of keeping up, and I think the key operative word is collaboration and transparency, in addition to making sure that we understand the risk collectively and make decisions. Ultimately, I think all of our goals is the patient. However, we also do realize that you know, there are things that from a security perspective that are not patient impacting, but to the point that Elizabeth brought up, legal and compliance issues, they're equally important from a, you know, reputation, from a cost perspective, and so on. However, it is critical, I think, to keep up. And I think some of the points that Abhi brought up of having the right expertise on your team, being able to keep up, having you know, work it, and for us also, it's work in progress. I mean, I think any manufacturer would say that they're continuing to work and get better. And we work very closely with a lot of vendors, similar process that we, the hospital or the healthcare providers have to vet medical devices. We also do the same for our own products and elements that get into our systems. I mean, there are two different types of, I mean, I see multiple different types of medical devices. You probably have heard a lot about the SaaS piece, which is software as a medical device. And then there's also software in a medical device, integrated into a medical device. That's the actual device that sits in the, you know, in the hospital. And then there's the SaaS piece. And then there's also MDDS. And so we have to realize that there are going to be more and more as we go forward, and the foundation infrastructure. I mean, everything that was said earlier, I mean, I can't echo more. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
Thanks, Uma, for that. There is a question in the chat box from Yoni. I don't know, Yoni, if you want to ask the question or you just want me to read it up. Okay, I guess I'm going to read it. So given what Abhi just said about COVID, are we looking at a moving target in terms of the HIPAA requirements? Do you see any trend towards change and allowing more wiggle room?
I'll jump in on that one.
Go ahead.
So, and I'll welcome Abhi's thoughts on this, obviously, from just from a CISO perspective. But from a legal perspective, I do think, you know, HIPAA and the regulations are, any regulatory scheme in the technology space or in the cybersecurity space and data privacy is necessarily going to be outdated as soon as it's printed, because the, you know, the technology and the efforts to, you know, to improperly get into the technology, you know, develop at a pace far faster than laws can be passed and regulations can be promulgated. So we, you know, the HIPAA regulations, many aspects are very outdated. I grapple with some of the, you know, the practical aspects of providing advice to clients when there are things in you know, even from the 2013 iteration, there are things that are not addressed or outdated, and the guidance documents that come out of HHS may not always be helpful. So I think that it's really important to you know, to keep an eye on it, but I do think there's an opportunity, you know, that a couple of OCR and HHS did waive some of the HIPAA requirements for short times during COVID crisis. But I do think that with telemedicine is a great example, as was mentioned earlier. Telemedicine is an example where I think that the immediate shift toward that means of providing care triggered by COVID will, you know, necessitate some revisions and thoughts about how we, you know, how HIPAA applies in that space, and there may be some additional regulations. Regulations were proposed in January, published in January, to amend the HIPAA regulations in some respects to make them more compatible with the ONC rules governing information blocking and interoperability. And there's a tension with, we've been talking about cybersecurity and privacy, but there's a tension between You know, having individuals get the information they need, or having providers access the information they need in a timely manner, so as to help the patient. So that's the aspect of interoperability and the prevention of information blocking. So trying to facilitate the appropriate stream and flow of access while still keeping cognizant of security. And I think we're going to continue to see a tension there as we try to figure out how to balance those two, not necessarily competing, but at first glance, dichotomous you know, efforts. One is to share information, the other is to protect it. So I think that we may see some changes. There'll be some discussions in the comments and responses to this last set of regs. And then, you know, with telemedicine, we've seen changes already in terms of what Medicare is paying for. And I think that the role of medical devices that provide or assist with the provision of care in a remote manner, we'll see a huge surge there as well.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. And we are getting close to the end of the hour, and I'm sure we can keep on talking about it for another hour or so. But, you know, I'll go on with the trend of Yoni's questions about the future, not necessarily with COVID, but obviously this is a big issue, you know, in terms of privacy. And I know that there is also a big question about it here in, not here because I'm in California, but in Israel, with the vaccines and the information that is giving, you know, to Pfizer and other companies based on you know, the results and the statistics that are found in Israel. Abhi, I see that you want to comment.
I just wanted to comment on one specific point. COVID did not really took away the necessity of complying with HIPAA. There was a very specific aspect, what was information sharing and how we do it. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, that please don't walk away from this dialogue that for somehow some reason that during COVID HIPAA was sort of given a waiver. No, that was not the case. Thank you.
Sure. So Ben, what would you, so since we're getting really close to the end, so how would you summarize it in terms of, first of all, what companies have to know and have to do, and what do you foresee for the future?
Well, I'm not sure if I have a crystal ball, but in terms of like just sharing my experience, companies that are in the health space, what they need to know first, they need to understand the market, they need to understand the compliance landscape, they need to understand what it is that they need to comply with. Typically, that will go back to very basic questions such as what type of data do you deal with and what's your market segment. So if you're in the B2B space in the US, so you will need to consider, you know, SOC 2, you'll need to consider ISO 27001, you need to consider integrating HIPAA controls into those, and basically, you know, just talking to the market, talking to the customer, because at the first customer that you'll try to work with, you'll get back a compliance checklist where they'll actually tell you what's the minimum acceptable.
Okay, great. So I want to thank all of you for participating here today. If there is anybody else who wants to ask a question, the last question, now it's a good time. Otherwise, I'd like to share with you that this session was recorded and will be available on the CICC YouTube channel. We also have some written materials. Thank you, Ben, for Elizabeth, for preparing a summary of the requirements and all the key words and the acronyms that companies need to know. We have here folks that are representing, from the names that I see on the screen, both cyber companies and medtech related companies, which is great. It's pretty broad. And I invite all of you, if you have questions to ask to any of our speakers, feel free to reach out, and we will be making sure to connect you to these folks. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time and expertise, and I wish all of you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.